Hello, in this video I am going to talk about the urinary system. So the urinary system is obviously named for the fact that it produces our urine, but in order to produce urine, what it's really doing is filtering our blood. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at how the urinary system is used to filter our blood. So the urinary system does a lot of regulation. So almost all of the functions of the urinary system revolve around regulating something. One of the main things that it's regulating is the composition of our body fluids. And it does this by filtering blood plasma. So blood is going to enter into the kidneys and then it will be filtered. And basically what the kidneys are going to do is they're going to remove waste from the blood. So the kidneys will remove water-soluble waste, especially nitrogenous waste like urea, which is where the word urinary comes from. But the urinary system also will return useful substances to the blood. The urinary system also regulates electrolyte balance, right, by filtering body fluids, and by choosing what is filtered out of these body fluids, we can balance our electrolytes, especially things like sodium, potassium, and calcium. The urinary system also plays a big role with regulating pH, right? And for example, it can do this by choosing to put acids into urine to get them out of the body. The urinary system also regulates red blood cell production because the kidneys produce the hormone erythropoietin, which causes the production of erythrocytes. And the urinary system is also plays a role with regulating blood pressure. So it does this in different ways. One of the things that the urinary system does is it releases renin, which is an enzyme that will lead to an increase in blood pressure. But by regulating how much fluid is in the blood, by regulating blood volume, the urinary system also regulates blood pressure. So let's take a closer look at the kidneys, which are the main organ of the urinary system. Whenever you hear the word renal, renal is referring to kidney. Right? So we normally have two kidneys, and they're found in what's called the retroperitoneal position, which means that they are actually behind the peritoneal membrane of the abdominal cavity. And they're located around the level of your, between, I should say, your 12th thoracic vertebra and your 3rd lumbar vertebra. Sitting on top of the kidneys are your adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are part of the endocrine system, and they produce many different hormones like aldosterone, which is a hormone that will affect the kidney and cause us to retain more water in the body. The adrenal glands also produce cortisol, which is an important hormone when you're stressed out. And the adrenal glands, of course, produce adrenaline, which is an important hormone in our sympathetic nervous system response. Let's take a closer look at the gross anatomy of the kidney. Right? The outer layer of the kidney is called the renal cortex. Right? Parts of the renal cortex do go deeper into the kidney, and those are called the renal columns. Right? But most of the meat, if you will, that's inside the kidney is called the renal medulla. And the renal medulla is sectioned into different areas called renal pyramids. Renal papillae are the very ends of a renal pyramid. And what's going to happen is urine will be formed in both the renal cortex and the renal medulla, but then that urine will be sent to a renal papilla. And then from there, the urine is released into a structure called a minor calyx, which is a space in the kidney. The minor calyx leads to a major calyx, and from there the urine will be released into something called the renal pelvis. So the minor calyx, the major calyx, and the renal pelvis are just spaces in the kidney that are going to contain the urine. Once the urine is in the renal pelvis, the urine is sent to a ureter, which is a tube that leads from the kidney to the bladder. So nephrons are the basic microscopic functional units within the kidney. And the nephrons are the structures that are going to be filtering the blood plasma and producing the urine. So the nephrons are found in both the renal pyramids and in the renal cortex. Right? You have about 1 million nephrons in each kidney. And the nephron has two major parts to it, something called the renal corpuscle and then something called the renal tubule. So the corpuscle is the rounded bulbous part, and the tubule is the tube part. So let's take a closer look at the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is going to be the site in the nephron where blood plasma is filtered. The renal corpuscle has two major parts to it. It has a capillary called a glomerulus, and then an enclosing structure called the Bowman's capsule, which is also known as the glomerular capsule. So, as I mentioned, the glomerulus is just a special capillary that's inside the corpuscle, and this is going to be the capillary that is going to be involved in the process of blood filtration. Once the blood is filtered, the fluid called filtrate will enter into the space of the Bowman's capsule. So the Bowman's capsule is a cup-like sac that surrounds the glomerulus and collects the filtrate. The filtrate will then enter into a tube connected to the corpuscle, and this is our renal tubule. So the renal tubule is a tube system of the nephron that's going to collect the filtrate, adjust the composition of the filtrate, and then produce urine. The renal tubule has different parts to it. The first part of the renal tubule that's directly connected to the corpuscle is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal means closest to the point of attachment, so here the point of attachment being the renal corpuscle. The proximal convoluted tubule is called convoluted because it has lots of twists to it. Okay? In short, we call this the PCT. So the PCT now leads to another part of the tube called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. And then the nephron loop leads to something called the distal convoluted tubule. So it's further from the point of attachment, hence distal, but it's still twisty and turny, so it's still convoluted. We call this the DCT. And the DCT then leads to the collecting ducts. So the collecting ducts collect the urine and deliver it to the renal papilla. So because the job of the kidney is to filter blood, we obviously have to have a good blood flow going through the kidney. So let's take a look at the renal blood flow. So oxygen-rich blood enters the kidney through the renal arteries, right? And then there are branches that come off the renal arteries, and those branches have branches, and those branches have branches, but eventually this oxygen-rich blood leads to a branch called an afferent arteriole, right? Afferent means to lead towards the center. Here the center, again, is going to be the renal corpuscle. So the afferent arteriole is a blood vessel that's leading into the glomerulus of the renal corpuscle. Okay? So it's carrying blood to the glomerulus. And of course, we already know the glomerulus is a special capillary in the renal corpuscle that is going to be responsible for filtering the blood. Once the blood is filtered, some of the stuff has come out of the blood and has entered into the Bowman's capsule and is now called filtrate. But there is still stuff left in the blood, right? Like cells and protein, and there's still some fluid in there, right? And that blood has to leave the glomerulus, and it leaves the glomerulus through an afferent arteriole. Afferent meaning away from the center. The afferent arteriole is going to carry blood away from the glomerulus to a peritubular capillary. So the peritubular capillaries are another set of capillaries, and these are basically surrounding the renal tubule. The peritubular capillaries are going to be a part of reabsorption and secretion of substances into or out of the renal tubular fluid. So when it comes to urine formation, there's different parts to urine formation. There's the filtration part that happens in the glomerulus, but then there's two other parts to urine formation, and those are called tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. So what I'm saying here is that the peritubular capillaries and the renal tubule are going to be responsible for the tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion part of urine formation. And we'll take a closer look at this in a little bit. The used blood that leaves the peritubular capillary will eventually enter into a renal vein, which will then be sent to the inferior vena cava and then be sent back to the heart. So now let's trace the path of urine through the urinary system. So we're going to start at the glomerulus. This is the site where blood plasma will be filtered and we will form our filtrate. The filtrate then enters into the Bowman's capsule. From there, it enters into the proximal convoluted tubule, then into the nephron loop, then into the distal convoluted tubule. Now the fluid is in the collecting ducts, and then the collecting ducts lead to the renal papillae. At this point, the urine is released into a minor calyx, and then into a major calyx, then into the renal pelvis, then into a ureter. The ureters will then deliver urine to the urinary bladder. In order to leave the urinary bladder and enter into the urethra, the urine must pass the internal urethral sphincter, which is an involuntary muscular door. If that door opens, then the urine will enter into the urethra, but in order to get outside the body, the voluntary external urethral sphincter must be relaxed.